Well, it's interesting. I think the biggest mistake they make is not thinking a problem will ever happen. And so they don't prepare, they don't train their team. The more people that are up to speed when a crisis happens, the better off you are. As I said earlier, the more prepared you are, the better you'll survive and on the other side. And so I think if you can have a team around you that knows how to respond and what to do, it makes a dramatic difference.
This is Season 4, Episode 34 of the Missional Marketing Podcast. My name is Bart Blair. It's my privilege to welcome you to the 158th edition of our show. If you happen to be new to the Missional Marketing Podcast, welcome. And please make sure that you subscribe wherever you're listening to the show. We don't want you to miss any future episodes. And if you happen to be a regular subscriber or regular listener to our show, you might have noticed over the course of the last few weeks, we've been a little less consistent about getting our Friday podcasts released. Jason Hamrock, who is the CEO of Missional Marketing and the co-host of the show with me here, he and I have just had a crazy time coordinating our schedules so that we can get these episodes recorded and released on a timely manner. We're working on improving that. We're going to be wrapping up Season 4 here midway through the summer and getting ready to launch Season 5 as we get into the fall of 2024. I've got some great guests already lined up for the new season coming up, Season 5. So if you haven't subscribed, make sure that you do that because I don't want you to miss any of those future episodes. Today, we have a great episode coming for you, a great interview. I'm going to intro that for you in just a moment. But before I do, I want to give you the heads up on something that you need to know as a church communications person, as a leader in your church, as a person who is responsible for your church's marketing and communications. We have a great event coming up in September called the Church Communications Conference. That's right. The Church Communications Group, which is a division of Missional Marketing, is putting on live events. And you've heard us on the podcast talk about our roadshow events. Well, we're going to have a 2-day conference in September. It's September 19th and 20th. It'll be at Compass Church in the Dallas-Fort Worth area. And I want to give you a discount code. Are you ready? You can write this down. It's really easy. The discount code is FRIENDS, all lowercase. That's right. Friends, you're friends to Bart, friends to Jason, friends to the Missional Marketing Podcast, and you can get $100 off of your registration if you use that discount code. The registration, I believe, is $249 for the 2-day conference. So you can get $100 off of that. So it would only be $149. To register, make sure that you go to churchcommunications.com and you look under the events and you'll see the Church Communications Conference. We would love to meet you there, to see you there. I'll be there. Jason will be there. It'll be a great time. We have a number of guests coming in to speak on very, very relevant topics related to church communications and church marketing. We'll have some breakout sessions and also just a great opportunity for you to connect and network with other people that are in the trenches of church communications just like you. So make sure that you plan for that. Again, that's September 19th and 20th in the Dallas-Fort Worth area at Compass Christian Church. All right, let's get on to today's episode. For the third time, a three-peat guest, we have Phil Cooke on our show. Now, if you're new to our podcast, you might not know who Phil Cooke is. If you don't know who Phil Cooke is, you are missing out on some really awesome stuff. Phil is an author. He is a content creator. He is a film producer. The man has his hands in many, many different things. He does all kinds of coaching and consulting for churches and ministry leaders. And he has recently written a book dealing with a topic that honestly, I wish we didn't have to deal with, but it is one that we have to deal with. And it's about protecting your church during a crisis. Seems like every day these days, you pop on the internet or you turn on the news, and there's some pastor or some church that's in the news for all the wrong reasons. And you know what? One of the biggest mistakes that a church can make, and I'm going to quote Phil Cooke on this, one of the biggest mistakes that you can make as a church is just to assume that nothing is going to happen in or to your church and not have an emergency response plan, to not have a strategy for how you're going to deal with communicating both internally and externally, things that might put your church in the news. The wrong things. It's not the good news. It's the bad news. And as much as we don't want that to happen, as we're praying against it, these things do happen. So I think that you're going to find this conversation with Phil to be very helpful. And we want to encourage you to check out the book. Unfortunately, at the time that we recorded the podcast episode, it wasn't available. Jason and I did not get a preview copy, but Phil goes into a lot of detail about the things that he covers in the book. And the book is available now. We'll include some links in the show notes so that you can check that out. So That's all I've got to say to introduce this particular podcast episode. I want to thank Phil for being gracious enough to be on our show again. The time that we recorded this, he and his wife were moving from California to Tennessee. He was in the middle of a lot of stuff, but he made the time for us, and we really appreciate that. So without any further delay, here's Jason Hamrock, the CEO of Missional Marketing, and our podcast interview with Phil Cooke.
Well, Phil, welcome back to the show. How have you been, my friend?
I've been very, very well. It's the thrill to be back. I went to your website the other day and noticed this is my third time. So I hope I'm not overexposing myself on your podcast.
No, I'll speak on behalf of Bart and myself and everybody who listens. We love having you on the show because every time you're on, we learn something new.
You're very, very kind. I appreciate it.
Yeah. And you're going through some transitions, kind of picking up and moving, and just a lot going on in your world, huh?
Yeah, we're picking up and moving. We're leaving from California, moving to Franklin, Tennessee, Nashville, and following the grandkids. You just do that when you get to a certain point in your life. And doing what I do with producing programming and consulting with churches and ministry organizations, I can do that from anywhere. And so actually it'll put me closer to a lot of the clients we work with. So I'm excited about it, and we're actually looking forward to it. I'll miss a lot of people in LA, but we'll be coming back from time to time.
Oh, yeah. Well, they're going to be blessed to have you out there. So, yeah.
It'll be fun.
Very pumped. Okay. All right. So I'm really excited to really just dive into our topic today. And that is you wrote another book.
I wrote another book.
Yeah. Talk to us about this new book you wrote.
Well, I wrote a book called Church on Trial: How to Protect Your Congregation, Your Reputation, Your Mission, and Your Reputation During a Crisis. And a lot of people don't know that being a media producer all these years, early in my career, I started getting calls from churches that weren't sure how to handle a crisis. Now, I'm not a therapist, I'm not an attorney, but there are a lot of communication issues related to a crisis. How do we tell this story? Who do we tell it to? Do we hide anything? Do we hold back? All these a million questions. And I would go in and help them write a public statement or a communications, statement. How do we tell the congregation? All these things. And I've been involved in so many difficult, challenging, and frankly, weird situations over the years that I thought, seminaries and Bible colleges don't teach communication to pastors and ministry leaders. And I thought they need a handbook, some kind of a reference that they could have on their desk when something goes wrong. Because, man, as you see in the headlines almost every day, some pastors stepping down because of this, or a youth leader's exposed with, abusing children or something weird, or there's embezzlement issues. There's also outside forces, a church is sued, or somebody complains about a church on social media, a million things that could happen. And so I just wanted to put a book together that would give them a reference about what to do when a crisis happens. Tons of research indicates that a business, church, nonprofit always do better in a crisis if they're prepared. So I really want to help churches prepare.
Well, yeah, I always say it's not if, it's just a matter of when.
Totally. You know what? Social media has made it so easy to say something inappropriate that a lot of people see, do something inappropriate that a lot of people see. And in a text message, email world, word travels fast. And it's just really hard to stop the momentum once it happens. So you're exactly right. Yeah.
So would you say this book, which I love, unfortunately, I love the fact that you're diving into this topic. Unfortunately, we need it. But it's just a reality. So would you say this book is written for executives or comms, or yes?
No, I really wrote this for pastors, senior leaders at a church, elders, or board of directors at a church. Mostly it's for churches, ministries, nonprofit organizations. Yeah. Businesses may have a little different approach sometimes to these things, but for churches and ministries where, people look differently at a spiritual organization, and they rightly should. The standards should be high. And so when a crisis happens there, what do you do? And I often tell people that an attorney should be your first call, and they're going to be, incredibly helpful, but it's not an attorney's job to save your reputation necessarily. Their job is to win your case in court or defend you effectively. But I've actually seen situations where a church or a ministry won their case in court, but were pretty much trashed in the media. And a communication person, someone like me who's going to advise them on those issues, can really help get the story right and help save your reputation in the process. So I think that's important. My goal is not to protect anybody, the perpetrator certainly, I'm not here to cover it up or protect the perpetrator. I'm here to help the church survive and move on. So that's going to be really the theme of what I'm talking about these days.
Yeah. What do you think is, man, I don't, let's dive a little bit into the book, but
Sure.
go by the book. Okay. But tell us just like, what is like that common mistake that church leaders make?
Well, it's interesting. I think the biggest mistake they make is not thinking a problem will ever happen. And so they don't prepare, they don't train their team. I'll give you a great example of a church in Chicago that while I was writing the book, I got word that a church there who had actually, the pastor had spent time training his team and his ushers, he had two ushers, that one Sunday noticed there was a new visitor who seemed awfully focused on looking at kids, and he just couldn't take his eyes off the kids in the church. And so they got a little concerned, red flag went up, and they went over and introduced themselves to him, got his name, and then they checked it, and sure enough, he was a registered sex offender. And so, it was time at that point to sit down and have that conversation with him about where the boundaries are in church life. But that might have never happened had those two ushers not been alert and paying attention. So I really wrote the book for senior leaders, for board members. I mean, the more people that are up to speed when a crisis happens, the better off you are. As I said earlier, the more prepared you are, the better you'll survive and on the other side. And so I think if you can have a team around you that knows how to respond and what to do, it makes a dramatic difference.
Yeah. Are there any, it's like almost, Bart was just sharing a few examples in today's newspaper about churches, but are there any statistics that you've uncovered or discovered on how often this happens?
It's hard to tell. There are 300,000 churches roughly in the United States. And so we tend to see the headlines, which are the big, mostly sexually driven stories that are out there. The funny thing is, though, there are a lot of other stories about embezzlement. And in the book, I talk about a poll of pastors indicated that something like 4 out of 7 pastors have experienced financial misbehavior at their church. Somebody's embezzled money, someone's stolen money. I had a couple of media producers I was talking to the other day who are exploring this for a documentary and found out there's more than $1 billion stolen every year within churches. And so that's a huge problem. So, and it's interesting. I made a list for you guys that the top 5 reasons, let me tell you the top 5 reasons churches are sued, and that'll give you an idea of the wide range of this issue. I mean, number 1, sadly, is sexual abuse of a minor. I mean, that's horrible, horrible, horrible. And yet it goes on, and that's the number 1 reason churches are sued. The second reason is property disputes. Something as mundane as a property dispute, that happens more often than we think. The third reason is personal injuries. Kid breaks his leg on the playground, or a painter falls off his ladder while he's painting the church. A million things can happen there. Zoning issues are a bigger issue than we think. A very large church here in LA, a number of years ago, the city tried to take over some of their property for expansion of some of the things they wanted to do that would generate a tax revenue. They had to go to court. And so zoning issues are a bigger deal than we think. And of course, insurance coverage disputes. Very often, churches fail to keep up their insurance. And I tell you, in a lot of these crises, particularly accidents, injuries, things like that, an insurance policy can save the church. And so we forget sometimes that they're not all mega churches out there. There are a lot of small churches out there, and little things can, cause them to actually close their doors. So anything like this, I want to help a church prepare so they can get through it effectively and in a healthy way.
Yeah, you said something earlier that caught my attention. There's the financial aspect of it, which standalone, that could make or break your church literally without insurance. And then there's the public perception, which almost can do just as much harm to your reputation and obviously to God. So, when you think about both of those kinds of things, where does a church start when thinking about, okay, how do we put together a plan? Do we type something up and stick it on a shelf and pull it off if we need, what do you do?
Well, you buy my book, of course. That'll solve your problem. I'm teasing. Having a communications plan is important because when a crisis hits, it can be very chaotic. Now, many times a crisis is relatively small. It's not a life and death issue, and that's no big deal. Other times it is a life and death issue. If a minor's involved, and one thing I think we should discuss real quick is that Today, by law, if a minor is involved, authorities need to be notified. One of the big problems we're seeing out there today is that years ago, there were no laws in place about that. And then as the laws were being formed, they were state by state and kind of a patchwork, and pastors didn't really know what to do. Ministry leaders didn't know what to do. And now those young people, in fact, very often, the parents of a minor would say, look, we just don't want this to go public. We don't want to ruin Susan's experience at school or John's experience at school. We want to keep this quiet. And so now those kids are grown up and they're suing the church or suing the organization because they're saying, why didn't you deal with this, predator back in the days when I was young? So the bottom line is today, there's no way out. Whether the parents want to keep it private, it doesn't matter. It needs to be reported. And your attorney should, as I said, be the first call, and he or she will know who to report it to. Now, it is important to understand that I've actually seen pastors who came within a hair's breadth of going to jail, even though they had nothing to do with the crime, but they didn't report it in an appropriate amount of time. And one church that was in the news just recently waited 7 years to tell the congregation. They just assumed this youth leader who had this thing with a minor, they didn't know about the thing with the minor. They thought he was just fired. And they kept everything kind of quiet. And then 7 years later, the pastor reveals it to the church. And can you imagine? They don't trust the pastor anymore. They don't trust the church anymore. What do you mean 7 years ago, a kid was abused in our Sunday school program and you never told us about it? So that's why telling the story, getting the story out there in the right way is absolutely critical. Because as you say, perception is important and you can destroy trust pretty quickly.
If I'm a pastor, well, I am a pastor, and
Yeah.
I've got,
You are right.
I'm a pastor. I'm a pastor. I've got a church. I've got an elder team that helps me lead the church. Talk me through how would you coach me, Phil? I know that you coach churches through this, and you've written a book, and you've written a book because you've had a hands-on experience in walking churches through these types of situations. Let's assume that I haven't yet had the crisis that that's going to put my church on trial, but I want to be a proactive leader, and I want to walk my elders, my board through a process of putting a plan together. Where do we start? Like tangibly, what's the first thing that we ought to do collectively as a board to start putting our plan together for communication? I guess there's internal communication, there's external communication, there's who we call as a lawyer, there's what we say to the press and what we don't say to the press. Like how would you lay out, coach me through what I need to do?
Well, number one, I always look at the size of the budget. Every church is different. There are mega churches, there are churches of 50 people, and how much you can do really depends on your budget. Now, if you're a denominational church, if you're in the Assemblies of God, for instance, or some other denomination, they usually have resources you can tap into. They will have legal guides, they will have training, they will have attorneys that you can consult. So first of all, if you're a denominational church, explore what denominational resources you may have at your disposal, because that can make a big difference right there. If not, start with a budget. And then I always I put a communication plan together in the form of questions, really. For instance, where's your church located? Is it a dangerous place? Should we be more concerned about fencing? Should we be more concerned about security? A lot of churches and their mission is to reach people in difficult places. So a lot of churches are in dangerous places in the inner city, sometimes in rural areas. So where are you geographically located? That could make a real difference. Another question is the pastor or anybody on staff, do they have any communication training? Have they ever dealt with any issue like this? There are places where you can go. I can certainly recommend places where you can get some training in how to respond to a crisis like this. Also, social media plays into this in a big way. How we tell the story on social media is important. So do you have a person full-time on social media? Are they trained? Too often churches will have a communication director or a social media person who are more like, they're almost like McDonald's employees. You want fries with that? They just take orders. We need a postcard to mail for this outreach. We need a ad in the bulletin. They're not real strategic thinkers. So you need to get, connected with somebody who strategically understands how to deal with a crisis and how to communicate in those kind of situations. I would also ask if you have any relationships with local media. Very often it can make a dramatic difference for you if you have a friend inside a media platform in your community. I've worked with a number of churches that Had a local TV reporter that was a church member. Well, it's nice to have friendly media on your side. It's nice to have somebody that will tell your story and tell it with authority and tell the truth. That's really, really important. And I don't think all reporters are out to get you, but they're out for a story, and they'd like their story to be, as provocative as possible to get more viewers or readers. So if you have relationships in the media, I think that's helpful. I also think it's important to keep insurance policies up to date. We talked about that a little bit earlier, but very often I've been in situations where they just didn't keep insurance policies up to date. And if it was an injury situation, they really had some serious problems. Another thing that is really big for me is vetting employees. I'll tell you, even with small churches, I would go to the trouble and expense of vetting all my staff. And I would even consider, particularly if you're a medium to larger church, vetting your volunteer leaders. There are a lot of companies out there, vetting.com, and there are others as well, that are used to working with churches and understand how to look for crimes in the past, a police record, anything that would cause you to be afraid. We want to trust it. We're Christians. We want to trust everybody. But the truth is, you just never know who might be applying for a job at your church. I actually heard of a church when I was writing the book that they had a young man applying to be their youth director. And while the application process was going on, he was about to be interviewed in his final interview. A woman came forward and said, "Look, I'm an OnlyFans model," which means a nude model, essentially, online. And she said, "This guy is one of my biggest fans. He follows me like crazy." And of course, that ended that interview right away. So you just never know what's going on in people's lives out there. And it's important to figure out those things. A couple of last quick things I would say is your security team. Churches, I wrote a blog post about the importance of professional security just recently. And I got a lot of pushback from pastors who will say, I don't want my church to feel like, TSA at the airport. I don't want that vibe in my church. Well, again, you never know. I'm sure that church in Charleston a few years ago that had that young man come shoot up a bunch of people right after a service, I'm sure they might not have wanted to have that kind of feeling, but look at the lives a good security team might have saved. Yeah. That shooting in Nashville that happened even more recently. Yeah. We just don't know. There's just a lot of disturbed, mentally unhealthy people out there, and we just don't know what could happen. And I just think a trained security team doesn't have to be obvious. I did visit a church one time on the East Coast that you pulled up to the church and there was a police car parked by the front door. You walked in, there was 3 officers in uniform in the lobby. There was a giant security desk off to the side with big monitors and guys with badges. And that was a little over the top. There's a way you can integrate a good security team into your church so that people don't even notice. And I think that's so very, very important.
Yeah.
I'm kind of giggling because my home church is one of those churches where there is a cruiser parked in front of the door and there are armed police officers in uniform in the lobby, and the pastors have a tail that's obvious that they got the little curly, on your ears, and everybody knows who the tail is. I'm going to take this opportunity just to mention this. And I don't know if you get into this in the book at all, but most churches are unaware of the fact that the federal government, FEMA, actually offers a grant, a pretty significant grant for nonprofits that are trying to upgrade or implement new security features in their building. I will link to that in the show notes of this episode.
That's great.
I know a few churches, some of our missional marketing partner churches have actually received tens of thousands of dollars to add security cameras, to security doors and things in their property. And I'll tell you what, if the government is willing to pay for it, then why not? And a pretty high percentage of applicants that apply get it, especially those that are in higher risk areas. If you're in an urban center or your church is in a building or in an area in a community where crime tends to be a little bit higher, you have a much higher chance of actually qualifying for those grants.
I would love to see that link. My wife and I are on boards of the Salvation Army, and they have churches in extremely high risk places because they're doing amazing work in very difficult places. And that'd be a great thing to pass on. So that's really fantastic.
I will send that to you, Phil.
Yeah.
Thank you.
One thing that I get phone calls every now and then where a church wants to talk to me because something happened.
Yeah.
And no doubt you Google the name of that church and there's that article.
Yeah.
It's number 2, number 3. And they're asking, how did that pop up so high?
Yeah.
And I have to teach them about search engine optimization, the fact that news station has high rank authority. So when they post something and they link to your church's name, it's going to show up almost immediately because they have
I know a ministry where the ministry leader was arrested for drunk driving years and years ago. And if you Google that ministry, his mugshot is the first thing that pops up. Mm-hmm. And the first page or two is news stories about that incident. And like you say, it's horrifying, particularly once a crisis is over, that person has stepped down or they've been dealt with and you're moving on. You don't want people to, you're a new church and you don't want people to see that, but at least on the first page. And I think you're exactly right. Get somebody, connect with somebody. Google doesn't like people messing around with their search results, but there are inexpensive ways to fix it. The cheapest ways, and I'm a big believer in this, is I'm shocked pastors don't get up in the pulpit and say, hey, if this church has meant a lot to you, talk to people about it. Write on your blog about it. Write on your Facebook page about it. Write an article about it. Yeah. You ought to do, we think in terms of, PR in terms of what happens if something bad goes down, but we don't think in terms of telling about the positive stories that happen in our church. So the more good stories are out there, the more that negative stuff gets eventually pushed down. So that even inexpensive ways like that can make a big difference.
I've actually given advice to smaller churches. Change your name.
Oh yeah.
Just change your domain name, change your name, reset and go from there, because I'll tell you that article's never going to go away.
There is a place, I think, where the negative baggage becomes so big, so heavy, that changing your name is a really significant, a really important option. So that's great advice right there.
Yeah. Let me comment on what you said there just a second, Phil, because so our primary audience here that's listening are communications directors for the most part, or people who are responsible for the communications in their church. And one of the things I coach churches on as they're going through any type of situation like this is, the best way, as you just said, to deal with bad press is to bury it with good press. Most of our churches, generally speaking, do not have a consistent or regular plan for press releases to even promote the positive things that they're doing. And every church's communication strategy ought to have a regular rhythm of releasing press releases when good things are happening. You're sending a team of high school students to Honduras on a mission trip. Send out a press release. You're hosting a marriage conference. Send out a press release. Whatever it is that your church is doing that is a positive vibe, something that can be celebrated, not just in the church, but something in the community, you need to have a rhythm of releasing press releases. You build relationships with people in the media. What most people don't realize is that people in the media are typically looking for stories to tell. And if we're writing and creating good press releases and sending them out consistently, we're helping them do their job. And they want to write articles about us. Now, obviously, there are going to be some folks out there that could care less about what your church is doing, but there are the folks out there who will. And if you do have some bad press out there that's, ranking high on the internet when people Google your church's name, getting into a regular rhythm of releasing press releases is one of the best ways to combat that.
That's absolutely true. And people think in the digital age that press releases are dead, but they're really not, because you never know. I'm constantly amazed at requests I'll get from somebody who saw a press release we sent out, from winning some award at a film competition or from releasing a book. It's just really interesting. In fact, I had a conversation with our team this morning about a release about this new book. And I thought, even if we didn't send it out as a press release, just putting it on our website puts it out there online. So just get that story out, get your stories out there. We don't think about it enough. And I think we forget how exponential social media is. And if we had everybody in our congregation talking about this amazing church, their friends are going to see it. Their friends are going to talk about it. They'll pass it around. It's just amazing how many people will end up seeing something like that.
Yeah. I always encourage, obviously local, go to your local and just research those and ask them how you can submit a press release, or go to pr.com.
Yes.
It's just simple ways, but all that stuff really helps, especially when something negative happens. You're going to be more equipped to combat that.
Absolutely true. Absolutely true. Church on Trial is really a manual for that. I just want people to underline it, dog-ear it, share it with your senior team. I think it's really critical.
When's the book coming out? It's not out just yet, is it, Phil?
Street date is July 1st. And so it'll be, you could pre-order at my blog at philcooke.com, but it actually becomes available in July. And so, we're really excited about that. But I mean, it's interesting that you mentioned that so many communication directors are listening. I would say this to communication directors at churches and ministry organizations. If you want your career to move forward, get past the order taking stage. I kind of mentioned that a minute ago. Get to the place where you become a strategic thinker. If you look at some of the most effective churches in America, the communication director is probably the number 2 voice in that church. They're there to really advise the pastor, consult with the team, give them ideas, be an idea generator. And this is one area where if the more you learn about crisis situations, the more you're going to be the person that steps up. I even talk in the book about the kind of communication director that could step up and be the spokesperson during a crisis. There's very often we want the pastor or ministry leader to be the spokesperson, but in many cases they're, knee deep in dealing with a crisis and we need someone else. And so when the communication director is really articulate, really good in front of a camera, knows the facts and knows this stuff, that's the perfect person to have in front of you telling the story about what's going on.
Yeah. I got to do that for my church.
Oh,
praise the Lord. I never had to deal with bad press, but I got to deal with good press, which was fun.
That's good. That's good. Well, good press is a good way to start. So that way, if the bad press happens, you're ready for it.
Another little nugget is I made friends with some of the local media and I'd take them to lunch.
Oh, yeah. I can't.
Develop relationships. It's relationships. This whole thing is about relationships. And you are in the news business. If you're a communication director, that's what you do. You're pushing news. And so you just want to, take a minute to focus on that. You can find those people.
Jason, that's so good. Along that line, in the book, I talk about Pastor Jack Hayford, who was our pastor at Church on the Way here in LA for 20 some years.
Yeah.
And early in his, he told me that when he first came to Church on the Way in it was the first Foursquare church in Van Nuys. Nobody knew about it. Nobody knew about Jack Hayford. He said he just had a brainstorm to call the religion editor of the LA Times and take him to lunch. And he said, look, I know you're dealing with a lot of stuff because the religion editor was talking about all the religions there are in LA and how much you have to do. And he said, look, I don't know anything about those other religious faiths, but I know a lot about Christianity. And when a story comes up or you need research done, I'll put my staff at your disposal and I'll do whatever I can to help you. And that developed into a friendship over 20 some years that all during that time, whenever a story would come up in the LA Times about Christianity or any aspect of it, guess who got quoted? It was always Jack Hayford. I mean, we made a joke that Jack got millions of dollars in publicity free just from being that guy. So
just for taking him to lunch.
Yeah.
I'm having a deja vu moment. Phil, did you tell that story in one of your other books?
I may have. It's because
I've read that story, and I think I must have read it in one of Phil Cooke's books.
Well, nowadays, most newspapers and TV stations don't have a religion editor, but there's somebody there that will deal with those stories. Find out who that person is as much as you can and offer to help them, offer to take them to lunch. Just develop a relationship because, as I said, you have no idea the number of times I've been knee deep in a crisis with a church and the pastor just mentioned, oh, well, the news anchor for the local TV station is a church member. Well, hello, let's give her a call. So it just makes a big difference.
Yeah. Okay. So, is there anything we didn't ask that you feel like we should dive into?
One thing I'm really big on in the book is red flags. We're all Christians and we want to think the best of everybody. But I've discovered that as a result of that, we often don't pay attention to red flags when they show up. Now, we don't want to become a behavior cop at church. We don't want to start accusing people because a false accusation can destroy a life. It can damage a church. But just being aware, I mentioned those ushers, just that were paying attention to that new visitor that was looking at the kids the other day. Being aware, maybe it's a youth director that's spending a little too much time with one girl in the youth group, or maybe it's a executive pastor who comes in strangely looking like he has a hangover every morning. Maybe it's time to sit down and have a little conversation with that person, or go to a senior leader if you see it and say, I've been noticing this about Sam. Maybe we should have a conversation. Because if we could, nip it in the bud, as they say, if we could stop the problem when that red flag first appears, it's interesting that almost every case, when I've helped a church navigate through a crisis, when we get on the other side, I'll often get the senior team together and I'll say, okay, knowing what you know now, looking back over the last year, maybe 2 years, were there red flags that you should have noticed that you didn't? In almost every case, they'll say, absolutely. Now I know why Bob was doing this. And now I know why Susan kept doing that, or why Sam didn't show up here. And so I just think if we were just more sensitive about red flags in a positive way, not here to condemn anybody, not here to judge somebody, but when we see something, at the airport, they say, if you see something, say something.
Yeah.
And we probably should do that more in church and ministry situations, because it could literally save a life.
Yeah. So good. So good. All right. So, hey, everybody, go get this book. It's going to not only get it, open it up, earmark it, hand it out to leadership, buy one for the whole leadership team. Make sure you're well equipped and prepared for.
Yeah, philcooke.com is where you said people can find it. I'm assuming.
Yeah, Cook with an E, philcooke.com. And absolutely, you can go get it and pre-order it. You'll be the first to get it. But then in July, it'll start being available everywhere.
Fantastic. Phil, thank you so much.
Hey, thank you guys. You were fantastic. You do the best questions ever. So I really enjoy being on the podcast. You guys are great.
Yeah.
Good. Well, tell your friends about us. We'll tell our friends about you. And hey, we'll be praying that your California to Tennessee move goes smoothly, that none of your awards get broken in the boxes in transit. And whatever else is important to you. Reunion with your grandkids. No, that's thing.
That's precious.
Hey, for those of you who made it all the way to the end of this podcast episode, thank you so much for being a listener or a watcher of the Missional Marketing Podcast. We appreciate that. Remember that if you haven't left us a rating or review wherever you consume this content, we would love that. And if you haven't yet subscribed wherever you listen to your favorite podcasts, be sure that you do that so that you don't miss any future episodes. On behalf of Phil Cooke and Jason Hamrock, I'm Bart Blair, and this has been another episode of the Missional Marketing Podcast.